Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to everybody joining us on the line today. I'd like to acknowledge everybody for being here, particularly because we are in lockdown. So if you are in lockdown, our sincere welcome and thanks, and understand that this is a testing time for people. So please do take care of yourselves. My name is Monica Taylor. I'm facilitating this Human Rights Action webinar on serious vilification and hate crimes in Queensland. I'm joined by 4 really inspiring women panelists today as we shine a human rights lens over hate crimes and serious vilification. From Brisbane, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting here. I'm dialing in from West End, and pay my respects to the Turrbal and Yagara elders, elders past and present, and to future leaders. I want to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who are the leaders of tomorrow. If you would like to let us know where you're dialing in from, please use the chat function. We'd love to know the traditional lands that you're on, and we acknowledge, of course, that that is sovereign land and was never ceded. I'm just going to share my slide so that you can all see the wonderful panelists, share my screen, sorry, who are joining us today while I read out their wonderful bios. So hopefully people can see that there. All of our brilliant panelists have achieved so much throughout their advocacy and activism. I'd like to welcome first Rita Jabri Markwell. She is an advisor to the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network, which is a national body dedicated to securing the physical and psychological safety of Australian Muslims. Rita is currently involved in a lot of policy work concerning violent extremism and Australia's online sphere. She's co-chair of the Cohesive Communities Coalition, which is a collective of organisations representing more than 20 of Queensland's culturally diverse communities. And it was the coalition's really hard work that led to the current parliamentary inquiry that's being considered at the moment taking place. So an enormous amount of work has been conducted by that coalition group. Abiba Andrea is going to be our second speaker today, and she's a representative of the South Sudanese African community. Abiba was born in South Sudan and she arrived in Australia in 2001. She is the Queensland African Community's Public Relations Coordinator and the Queensland African Youth Support Council Coordinator, where she provides support and services to African young people right across Queensland. Our third speaker is Matilda Alexander, and Matilda is a great friend of the community legal sector. She is CEO of Queensland Advocacy Inc. She's a leader and an award-winning human rights lawyer with a lengthy history in the community legal sector, having led the Prisoners Legal Service for many years, and also she is president of the LGBTI Legal Service. Matilda's also worked at the Queensland Human Rights Commission and Legal Aid Queensland, and has run cases on vilification under the Anti-Discrimination Act here in Queensland. Our fourth, but by no means last speaker, is Naraja Clay. She's a proud Kalkadoon and Boogaman woman from far north Queensland who currently lives and works in Mianjin. Niraj is a passionate young woman seeking to improve the lives and futures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, and she does this through her extensive advocacy and leadership. Naraja is chair of the Headspace National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Group and is a member of the Queensland Mental Health Commission's Mental Health and Drug Advisory Council. So the way we're going to roll, folks, is I'm going to first invite Rita to explain why the Queensland Government is considering reforms to strengthen existing laws about serious vilification and hate crimes. Then each of our speakers are going to share their perspectives on the need for stronger laws to better combat racism and vilification in our community. So Rita will pass directly to Abiba, and then we'll hear from Matilda and finally Naraja. And then afterwards, pending time, we're going to have a Q&A discussion and a panel discussion to really tease out the human rights implications of these potential new laws and why reform is needed. The conversation may bring up some strong emotions for people, and if that's the case, please look after yourselves and do what you need to do. You can hop offline if that's what's necessary. We are recording this event, and the full presentation will be made available to people afterwards. The really key takeaway for you in the audience today is to really encourage everybody to take the time to make a submission to this inquiry. Personal stories are so valuable and so powerful, but also the voices of mainstream services that value dignity, respect, and human rights. So if you're in the audience and you're a mainstream service provider, we really encourage you as well to make a submission. The key time factor, of course, is that submissions close on Monday, the 12th of July. So that's just 7 working days from today, folks. And it's at midday that they're going to close, not 5 p.m. Don't let the time trip you up. Just a few housekeeping. I'll just stop my screen share. Just a few housekeeping notes for everybody. We obviously are in broadcasting mode through webinar. So there's the Q&A function, and then there's also the chat function down the bottom there. So please use that if you want to ask any of our panelists a question. And I think that's the main introductory remarks. I'm going to hand over now to Rita to take us forward. Thank you so much, Rita.
Thank you, Monica. And hello, everybody. Peace and greetings to everyone. And it's wonderful to see so many people calling in from all different parts of Queensland. Yeah, so if I'm one of the co-chairs of the Cohesive Community Coalition. I think someone just stopped my video, so you might want to pop, I'm not sure. Okay. And I'm back, I think. Or okay, we'll keep going. Yeah, so what happened following the start of COVID was we saw this increase in hate incidents affecting Chinese members of our community and all Asian members of our community. And at that point, the Queensland Human Rights Commission put out a call to some different leaders of different cultural groups and said, why don't we have a conversation about what's happening in the community and what needs to be done. As soon as we had representatives from Muslim, Jewish, Indian, Asian, African, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, the Sikh community, around that virtual table, we discovered that we knew each other's lived experience immediately in terms of what people are experiencing: street harassment, harassment in public places, shopping centres, public transport, at work, in school, online, and how crushing that racism is to people's lives and the impacts it has. I, at that moment, knew that we were at a critical moment because we were just before the state election. So a group of us legal advocates created an options paper that poured through all the case studies that we had and came up with practical solutions drawing from overseas and Australian jurisdictions. It went to the Labor and LNP parties, and the Labor Palaszczuk government committed to referring it to a parliamentary inquiry if we were, if they were re-elected, and they were. So we are now in this moment where we have a parliamentary inquiry. It's the first time in 30 years, right? This legislation has been in effect, the Anti-Discrimination Act. The one hate crime law we have here has been used 2 or 3 times. There's a lot of procedural barriers that need to be removed so it can be used, and that is it's a crime to do with inciting harm against a group on the basis of a protected attribute. But we also believe there are other things that can be done, very straightforward things. We have a lot of base criminal offences like public nuisance, property damage, assault, that could have a hate aggravation added to them, which just means that where there is that extra harm to a victim or to their group because they're attacked because of who they are, not because of something they've done, but because of who they are at a fundamental level, that would be recognised and attract a higher penalty and be called a hate crime, which is so important to the community to have that recognition that there has been that attack on their inherent dignity. So we are really passionate about getting that aggravation into the law. And the third thing is dealing with the online hate. Obviously, the current conciliation-based system puts a lot of burden on victims to try and get justice, and we are interested in alternatives to that problem. And the fourth thing is about achieving immediate and sustained protection for victims of hate crime. So we are looking at apprehended like violence orders kind of or injunctions. We're looking at restorative justice options. The community is really passionate about how do you community conferencing where the victim agrees, obviously, but how do we bring people together to turn it into an educational moment, particularly when it's something like public nuisance, where someone has harassed someone on the streets. So we've got a lot of solutions that we've brought. We are continuing to develop as a group, and we're socialising at the moment with anyone who's interested. And I'm really excited that this time has come. There is so much alignment. Queensland Police has also supported this call. We actually met with Queensland Police and went through and talked to some of our ideas through with them. And we are just we just want to change this idea that all of this reality is normal, because it's not normal and it doesn't have to be normal. Racism doesn't have to be part of our lives and part of our loved ones' lives and our children's lives. The impacts of someone going about their life and being terrorized because they wear a hijab, right, is long lasting. There is nothing you can do. You can't change your behavior. As long as you continue to wear that hijab, or as long as you continue to have that skin color, you are always potentially a target. And that sows these seeds of anxiety into people. It makes people withdraw from a lot of different careers and ways of life. And then we see that flow-on effect, lack of diversity in our parliament, in our media, in our public service. It's a crippling problem, and now is the time for us to stand up against it. And I really encourage everyone to make a submission, whether you are a victim, a survivor, or an ally. Please make a submission. Thank you. And I'll now pass to Abiba.
Sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Hello?
We can hear you, Abiba. That's
terrific. Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, yes. Yeah, I'm going to speak more based on my experience growing up here in Australia. And a lot of the stuff that Rita said is absolutely right. It does definitely draw a lot of us away from, public services or even just employment in general. So I came here when I was about 5.5 years of age, and racism for me, I kind of got used to it growing up, but even saying that, that's sad to say, because it should never be something that you should be used to. We've over the past couple of maybe year or so, street harassment within our community has actually grew. We found that a lot of our young people, especially a lot of our people in the community, especially the young people, have been experiencing verbal abuse, racial verbal abuse. I've actually experienced a couple of months ago, just going about my business, going about my day, and I was just told to just, go back to my country. And with the incident with the 3 girls with COVID a couple of months ago, in regards to the false declaration, that also had a huge impact on members of our community as well, because they were also getting attacked, whether they went to the shops or just, walking on the streets. They were just automatically targeted. So growing up, honestly, within our community, racism has definitely been something that we've been finding hard to tackle. So yeah, but I work with young people all across Queensland, and one of the main things that I find that a lot of them speak about is that when they go into jobs, they're most likely just either get called out on their skin a lot of the time, or looked at like they're incapable of doing something because of, especially if they're the only ones that are the only fair, like black skin or something like that, and they looked at like they're incapable or not understanding. I think that's where another thing is that they don't understand without speaking. You know, I used to be always told that I speak too white, which I don't understand what that even means. Speak too white or speak too proper. Just give me a moment, can you guys please? Yeah, so sorry about that. So yeah, like experiencing that, it's really definitely took a turn on a lot of us. Me personally, I used to really, I didn't want to step out of the house. I didn't want to go to work sometimes because I just felt like I was not included. And I think that a lot of issues needs to be looked at in terms of how do we manage racism? You know, because when someone is called out or told to go back to their country, and coming from a war-torn country like South Sudan, you think that you feel safe here, but coming from the traumas there, you don't want to live in a country where trauma is going to be also built upon, if that makes sense. You know, it's a home that's supposed to be peaceful. It's a home that's supposed to be respected, included. You know, we're supposed to feel inclusive. But if we're not feeling included, or and we're consistently being targeted because of the color of our skin or how we look, then, you know, we're gonna forever not feel like we're Australians or included here. And I guess that's the importance of this this act, you know, this campaign, to really include all Australians and be inclusive. And regardless of where you're from, you should always be considered Australian. You know, not when something's wrong, you're African, or when something's right, you're Australian. It should be all over, and everyone should just be treated equally in that sense. So I will pass it on to Matilda now. Thank you, everybody.
Matilda, you're on mute as well.
Thank you, Abiba, and my solidarity to you and to your community in combating that terrible racism that you've described. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which I am, in Meanjin as well, and to acknowledge the LGBTI members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, brother boys and sister girls, that are here with us today. And also, because I am representing two hats, I've got two hats on today, the people with a disability who are members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. Now, the LGBTI legal service, since its inception 10 years ago, has fought against unlawful vilification in our communities. So it's good to have this opportunity to reflect on those battles today. In our community, and especially for transgender women, we regularly experience vilification, including horrifically violent hate on a regular basis. Our lawyers have gone through the vilification legal process alongside many individuals and have seen the huge impact of the current process on these clients. We've also attempted to use the current laws to address systemic issues of prejudice. For example, in 2018, the Marriage Equality Postal Survey opened the door to homophobia and transphobia being expressed under the guise of legitimate debate. And in fact, much of that debate constituted unlawful vilification. Over a matter of months, 220 examples of unlawful vilification were reported to our office. From posts on social media to verbal abuse, to swastikas on buildings, to posters on uni campuses. Individuals who contacted our office and wanted action taken generally didn't feel empowered to take that action themselves. Many people were debilitated by the abuse they were seeing everywhere and suffered enduring impacts on their mental health. So the idea of starting extensive litigation was too daunting. The LGBTI Legal Service had the legal standing and power to take legal action on behalf of the LGBTI community. And so we commenced a kind of reverse class action where we instituted proceedings against 25 of the worst offenders. Some of the comments were removed over the course of the litigation. However, even with additional resourcing from government and pro bono firms and our very best efforts, accountability for the overall hate shown against the community was extremely limited. There was no accountability for the majority of vilification that was reported during the postal survey because no one had sufficient investigative or regulatory powers to identify respondents and to stop vilification in its tracks. One of the best outcomes of this campaign was the distribution of our materials in the Muslim community and an ongoing and productive partnership between our service and Muslim organisations here today. And I think this demonstrates that human rights are not divisible. It's not LGBTI rights versus religious rights, no matter how many times politicians try to put us in opposite camps. We are all standing together for human rights and against hate. Aside from the administrative burden of bringing civil litigation, there's also a personal cost. Even though the case was not in my name personally, I was attacked online by far-right groups who set up websites accusing me of an orgy of thuggery and vandalism. And I was somewhat creatively referred to by the respondent's solicitor as a squishy blancmange. Financial compensation is unlikely to be available for litigation brought by an organisation and minimal for individuals. And the current litigation process takes 3 or 4 years from start to finish. These are all reasons why there needs to be a greater role for government in stopping litigation and changing culture. And I'm not talking about more police, because in many cases, they would not be best placed to do this. We need to look at creative solutions that will ensure accountability and put an end to physical, verbal, and published expressions of hate without placing further burdens on those affected. Despite these burdens, the legal service continues to fight vilification. Last year, there was a story time event with drag performers in a local library, which was protested against by the UQ Young Liberal Club. This led to horrible commentary from multiple conservative commentators, which we believe constituted vilification. We subsequently had success in a case against a petitioner who was allowed to publish an online petition referring to LGBTI people as pedophiles and requesting that the Brisbane City Council prohibit LGBTI events and materials in libraries. We ended up with a public apology that was actually genuine, and the man we brought the case against ended up joining with us to call for more accountability and better transparency from government, and asking that responsibility for compliance with vilification and human rights laws sit with government rather than relying on individuals. So firstly, there's this question of process. So even where hate speech is unlawful, as is currently the case on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity, how do we make those rights real, especially at times of increased tension in our community? And Rita, you give a great example there of COVID for people who of Asian appearance in our community. So research has suggested that the reason why our current provisions are underutilised is twofold. Firstly, people simply don't know about them, either to curb their terrible behaviour in the first place or to take action against it. The second reason is the process itself is daunting and re-traumatising it, making it difficult for those affected to be the ones responsible for stopping the behaviour. I would also like to address the question of who are we protecting with current laws, and propose expanding the unlawful hate speech provisions and the unlawful vilification provisions to other people who should be protected. From an LGBTI perspective, this would include a person's HIV or AIDS status and sexual characteristics, gender expression. And from a disability perspective, this would include making hate speech on the basis of disability unlawful. There are many examples of people with disability being publicly ridiculed and treated with contempt due to their disability. For example, a cafe putting a joke on their message board in Australia saying, "My girlfriend broke up with me, so I stole her wheelchair. Guess who came crawling back?" Jokes are published about disabled people being vegetables, and a professional journalist who tweeted after receiving poor service, something saying, "It's great the service is providing so many jobs for the mentally handicapped." People regularly use words associated with disability as insults. You're insane, you're mad, you're crazy. And these phrases can cause great harm to people with disability when used in a contemptuous way to ridicule them publicly because of their disabilities. We've been shamed and shunned and looked down on for too long. The responsibility for stopping hatred against us cannot simply sit with us, but must be a broader community and government responsibility. And on that note, I'll hand over to the wonderful Naraja Clay to talk about the impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
Thank you for that, Matilda, and thank you to all the other panelists who've shared their experiences and thoughts this morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on. I'm in Meanjin or Brisbane, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Yagara and Turrbal community here and acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present with us today. Yeah, so I guess I'll talk a bit about my experience as a young Aboriginal woman growing up in Queensland. I didn't always see the racism or the discrimination. It wasn't always apparent to me, and I guess that was being a kid. I also grew up in foster care, so I think that had its own different things with the carers I had. But coming back to Brisbane as an adult, which was like 4 or 5 years ago now, I could see firsthand the racism and the discrimination. And, you know, I recently had an experience, I think it was a couple of years back, I was in the Maya Centre. I wanted to buy a dress for a gala dinner, and I had, you know, maybe about like 4 or 5 dresses in my arms to go try on. And the girl, she had seen me the whole time, and she completely ignored me, then walked around the other side of the clothing rack to go and help someone else in the store. And so I just kind of put everything back up on the rack and walked out. And it was really disappointing that given in this day and age that we do live in, that I guess, yeah, we call them microaggressions. I don't think that was a microaggression, it was pretty straight out. But microaggressions have become so normal. It's such a normal experience for the cold community and the BIPOC communities in Australia that it's not necessarily considered, like every time I have an experience of racism, it's not something that I necessarily stew on or think about. It's just, oh, that's another one, or another experience. And it just kind of goes onto the pile of racially horrible experiences that I've had. And when we look at the impact on the mental health of, or like the impacts on the mental health of these communities, there was a paper that I was reading, and it was titled it was a cross-sectional survey, done looking at the mental health impacts of racial discrimination. And they used I think it's called the Kessler distress tool or something, I can't remember exactly. But essentially it looks at the levels of distress that people are experiencing, and particularly in the culturally and linguistically diverse community, the mean K10 in this group was 13.5, and then they had 17.5% scoring over the threshold of high or very high distress. And I would imagine there isn't actually a lot of research about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and I'm not advocating per se for that kind of research because, you know, we are also humans, and to pathologize our experiences is another, I guess, form of violence towards these communities. But I do think we need to spend some time talking with these communities and really understanding their experiences and how it impacts. An example I gave of, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, is that when we're born into this world, we have a bucket, and we call it we're going to call it the resilience bucket in this scenario. But pretty much an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child, their resilience buckets, they already have holes in them when they're born. And so it's really hard to kind of try and tape up this bucket from the inside and give all these young people skills and tools to become resilient when their everyday experiences are just putting more and more holes in their buckets. So yeah, I guess prevention is key with this, particularly for our diverse communities that do receive a lot of this discrimination and hate. I think I might wrap up there, if that's okay. Thank you for your time.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Naraja and Matilda and Rita and Abiba for being so frank and honest in sharing your stories. And a reminder to everybody in the audience that if it does get a little bit testing, please look after yourselves and do what you need to do. The point that you were just talking about then, Naraja, takes us so neatly into considering the human rights impacts of that kind of hateful action and language on people day after day after day, the compounding impact that has on people's mental health and their outlook and their ability to feel included in Australian society, as came through so clearly in Abiba's stories shared as well. We have a right to freedom of expression now protected in the human rights legislation in Queensland, but of course, rights are not absolute. So people can express how they feel and think, but we need to make sure that that is done in a respectful way that is safe and has dignity for others. So, I was just thinking about the inhuman and degrading nature of being on the receiving end of those insults. That is obviously another protected right in our legislation, as is the right to life and as is the right to feel safe. Matilda, I'll just throw it back to you as a human rights lawyer and somebody who's quite versed in the legislation, whether you've got any particular comments about the importance of strengthened protections from a rights perspective.
Yeah, from a rights perspective, I think that we do need to balance those rights, the freedom of expression against the protections against racial equality. And I think that the Queensland law does do a good job of drawing that line. It recognises the harmful and destructive impact of vilification. Free speech is never an absolute, and we certainly have had that response from the litigation that we brought, that, oh, well, what about free speech? And yeah, I often say to people, well, would you have the free speech to make a bomb threat? No, there are certain behaviours that cause harm to the community, which should be falling on the other side of that line between free speech and equality. And human rights is a balancing act. So our Human Rights Act and human rights in an international sense say human rights are not absolute. They need to be balanced against each other. And this is a good example. And it's a fairly well-established one. Many jurisdictions around the world have protections against hate speech, and they are jurisdictions that also protect freedom of expression.
Indeed. And I know, Rita, your work, I'm going to throw to you now just to talk about the proliferation of hate speech in that online context as well, because it's one thing for people to feel it face to face in the street, but I guess the snowballing impact of communities that are really proliferating those messages and how damaging that can be.
Thank you, Monica. So at the federal level, we now have an Online Safety Act, which just passed, which does provide protection against cyber abuse and cyberbullying, which is where it's targeted at an individual. So it doesn't provide, and it is at a certain level of harm, serious harm. So it doesn't provide protection where, say, there is someone who is inciting hatred or dehumanizing a whole group based on a protected attribute, which we see, unfortunately, a lot in hateful echo chambers online. Now there's a lot of discussion about white supremacy and white nationalism, and we know that the ideology of Brenton Tarrant, for example, was very prolific online. There's research showing how prolific it was on Facebook in the years before his Christchurch massacre, for at least 10 years before. And it continues to be prolific because a lot of dehumanization of Muslims, Jews, immigrants, people of colour, First Nations peoples, LGBTQI people, women, people with disabilities. All these groups are targeted typically by those extremist groups that take a sort of a victimhood or a very chauvinist and white supremacist mentality. We are left at the moment to try and combat this problem as communities by ourselves, which is, as Matilda pointed to, is really unfair. And we need to make these human rights real, which means that we need processes that don't leave the burden on us as a community. And I know Matilda has some ideas on this front, which she might want to speak to. I know that we've been pushing for civil penalties at the national level, and I think we'll probably be pushing for them at the state level as well. And there are also ideas about a criminal offence, but I know that is contentious. So I'll pass to Matilda if she wants to comment on that.
I'll just jump in before we do, because I think that lines up quite neatly with a comment in the chat function right now. Yeah. So Brittany has thanked everybody for sharing stories. It's quite a long comment, but I'll just read snippets of it. If the criminal offence of serious vilification is moved to Summary Offences Act or other legislative changes are made so that police treat these complaints as a criminal matter, do any of the panellists have concerns about how those offences could be used to criminalise the behaviour of people with those attributes we are seeking to protect? So going to the overrepresentation of First Nations people in the criminal justice system, so the misidentification, coming back to the way in which policing happens, any particular comments on that? I guess that could be a question for Matilda, also Naraja and Abiba, to share some thoughts about, what policing really of this conduct. I'll throw to you first, Matilda.
Yeah, I think I said in my statement before, I'm interested in exploring more creative options. I think that just going to the police, already it's a criminal act, and that hasn't provided much of an outcome for anyone, and the high standards of proof associated with criminalising the lack of access for aspects of our community. So yeah, I think we need to look a bit more creatively, maybe, like how the Fair Work Ombudsman has regulatory and investigative powers over workplace matters. Maybe the Queensland Human Rights Commission could have increased powers of investigation and powers to actually take action to bring down matters that are identified as hate. I don't have one single model or answer that I'm proposing, but I think that we could come up with something better than criminalising.
Abiba and Naraja, please jump in.
I absolutely agree with what Matilda just mentioned. I think it's just really identifying those aspects. There's no really proper answer into how that can be. But yeah, I absolutely agree with Matilda.
Yeah, I would say that I agree with both Matilda and Abiba. It is, a concern. I mean, I haven't made an actual report to the police, because there's been so many times where I've gone into the station and I've talked to the officer at the desk, and I've had such a disgusting interaction with them that I've decided that whatever I've experienced was not worth having to deal with the police about it. So I think, civil, or I'm not sure exactly what it looks like, but I don't know how helpful it would be to over-criminalise, or not over-criminalise, but anyway. Sorry.
And also, this is everybody's responsibility. Like the two examples that I gave, marriage equality, postal vote, why wasn't the government clearly saying, in this debate, hate speech will not be tolerated? They opened a debate but didn't put those parameters on it. In the second case that I mentioned with the library drag event, the City Council allowed this petition with calling LGBTI people pedophiles to be published on their website. Like, that was hate speech. Why would they publish that? So I think that there are a range of different creative solutions, and the buck really does stop here, 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 and here when it comes to government accountability.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that political discourse does have a tremendous impact on the level of hate incidents and crime, whether it's terrorism discourse, asylum seeker discourse, the discussion about COVID, the discussions about China. We see those impacts flying right onto the streets. And you're right, until the government needs to be accountable for what it says and the tone it sets.
And I'd just like to add to Rita and Matilda's point, there's been a lot of discussion about what does the mental health sector, what is their responsibility in kind of leading these conversations. And through different conversations that I've had, I realized that the way that we as a country, I guess, and society need to be moving forward is that we need to, for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, we need to be having truthful and hard conversation about the history and how the violence that was initially perpetrated against this community is still being perpetrated through policies and practices and legislations. I mean, you've got a situation where in Queensland we have more children removed under current child safety legislation than in the stolen generation. And that's a concern for me when we're in 2021 now, and I'm not quite sure of what the rates are looking like, but I don't believe they're not reducing. So, you know, we do need to be having a big conversation of how is child safety legislation in this scenario supporting, racial discrimination on all levels.
Absolutely, Naraja. It is about having solidarity, you know, across all of those issues, and recognising that this is ultimately, you know, we need to fight for the sort of society we want everybody to enjoy. And I mean, the racist dimensions of so many parts of, you know, intervention of decision making in people's lives has, you know, it's on the record, and it's an absolute cause of concern. I think that kind of call out for solidarity is just so important. That's really, you know, QCOSS's intention in holding this event. You know, our vision is equality, well-being and opportunity for every person in every community, and the call out for all the mainstream organisations on the phone, on the line, really to make a submission before the closing date, so that if not personal stories, then certainly arguments and creative legal thinking about how this issue can be addressed with solutions is what the parliamentary committee needs to have before it to be able to recommend strengthened laws. I
really support what Naraja said about the violence of public discourse around and laws and policies affecting First Nations peoples, and the lack of compassion for the grieving of First Nations peoples, I think, is a form of violence, and our silence is a form of violence. So I'm very much supporting you 100% what you've just said. Secondly, I just want to add on police. There is a different point of view on policing. If a family is attacked on a train for being, you know, I'm just thinking a real life example, for being Muslim, have their children threatened to be thrown off a train, they go to police expecting to have some sort of protection and safety, and police tell them to go home and sleep on it. It is terrible, and that shouldn't be the reality. Police should be there to protect everyone's rights to enjoy public places in peace and in safety. And so I would stand by the idea that we do need our criminal laws and our police to enforce that right for every person without prejudice. But I'm very mindful of the concern about it being used in a vexatious way against certain communities that are over-policed as well. And I think that needs to be really monitored because any charge needs to be in the public interest. It can't be because police are just trying to pile up a charge sheet. Thank you.
So please continue to send through your thoughts if people do have on the chat line. In terms of racial profiling and that sort of policing, Biba, I know that some of the work that you do with African young people, that's been a really big part of your work. Are you able to sort of comment on some of the stories that might have even been shared in the options paper or that you've heard over the course of the work that you do?
I do have a personal story actually, that it wasn't to do with young people, but it was actually my family that was involved. They had a dispute with one of their neighbors, and the neighbor apparently for a while actually had been a big disturbance to the whole neighborhood. But my auntie's been living in that house for the last couple of years, and this neighbor just moved in and only been there for a month or two. And as quick as they moved in, things kind of escalated very, very quickly. And I was in the house looking after my little cousins when one of my cousins that was playing outside in the park, who was the age of 5, actually came running in and said that the neighbors' kids were actually calling them names, telling them they were too black, they weren't allowed to play with them, they had to leave the park. And keep in mind, these neighbors have just moved in that neighborhood. They haven't been there for a while. So my family's been there for the last 5 years. And this is a 5-year-old kid. So my concern there was, okay, if it's happening at that young age, is it also the education aspect of it, like actually educating parents, having those conversations with your kids? Because my little cousin actually cried. She cried, and we called the police because I suggested calling the police because obviously it's been ongoing for a couple of weeks. So when I called the police, we explained the situation to the police officer, and my auntie had all the proof and everything about when it all started, what the neighbors were saying, and it got to a point where my auntie actually got into a physical encounter with the neighbors, because when they called the police for the first time, it took them an hour to arrive. We called them for the second time. We waited almost 2 hours for the police to arrive. And when they did arrive, they told us that we needed to contact council to report the racial abuse to council, which did not make any sense. But that's something I've noticed with a lot of our community's members. When they call the police, they've been directed elsewhere, and it does not help. And then all of that will turn into like a physical encounter. Our young people just fight it off because there's no point to them, they don't see a point of going to the police because the police will also racially profile them without even understanding the situation. So when they get provoked, they're gonna take matters into their own hands. So when that incident happened with my auntie, there was 2 officers, and I actually asked one of the officers, what's the council's gonna do about it? Like, this family has been abusing my family for the last couple of weeks, calling them all sorts of names. They're not paying their rent. They did not move them here. And the fact that you guys already had complaints about this particular neighbor about this kind of behavior, where's the hope in actually calling you guys out for assistance or for help? You know, it was just it was a worthless conversation at the end of that because it didn't get anywhere. And not long after that, my auntie actually got into a physical fight with one of the neighbors about the same thing. And this time the police was not called, because if the first time they're gonna come and not do anything about it, there's no point. And that's with a lot of our communities, and young people face that consistently all the time, having no faith in the police whatsoever.
Wow, thank you, Abiba, for sharing that. Gosh, an example of under-policing compared to over-policing, or very sort of selective policing, depending on the complaints coming forward. We've got a question in the chat, which I'll pose to everybody, and I think it's probably maybe a nice way to wrap up, actually, because we've got a little bit of time left. Monica, not me, has asked, what changes would you like to see in the education and awareness space? So obviously a really great question about law reform always needing to have community education wrapped around it as part of that. I think really inspired by the story that you've just shared, Abiba, of children being racist to other children. So open to everybody to answer that on the panel. Naraja, maybe you've got some ideas about education.
Yeah. So I was part of a panel last year, and we were having a discussion about the movie In My Blood It Runs, which follows a young 12-year-old boy from Alice Springs, just as like a snapshot kind of his life. And one of the points that I drew out and wanted to talk to people about from that movie was there was a lot of, I guess, conversation in that movie of Dwan's engagement with education in that formal setting of a school, and talking about how he was acting out and being rude, not getting along with other kids in the class, things like that, essentially portraying this child to be a troublemaker and antisocial and all those kind of things. And then when they took a video of the class, you had the teacher telling a story about Australia that was in direct conflict of the traditional stories and the history that Dwan was told at home and in his community. And so when you contextualize that even more, it became very obvious that the education setting and being in a classroom was actually a trauma experience for this young person. And these challenging behaviors he was displaying were actually just symptoms of trauma. And I think when we look in that particular setting, I think it comes down to governments, again, holding that onus and responsibility of what I call, truth-telling sessions. And that's having those really honest, hard conversations about the history of Australia and the impacts on the communities, like the First Nations communities, and the ongoing impact. And that, we're not looking, I personally, as an Aboriginal person, I'm not looking to hang any particular white person out to dry over anything. I think, in this day and age, we all have a responsibility to talk about the hurt of Australia and talk about how we can forge a pathway moving forward that's equitable to everyone. And I didn't say, equal, I said like equitable, because that's what we need. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's just sent chills down my spine. Any other closing remarks by anybody else on the panel?
I would issue a challenge to everybody, the 58 people who are here today, to go out and share the news, if it's news, or the information if you already knew it, that it is unlawful currently under Queensland law to do a public act, including putting something on Facebook, sharing a meme, that kind of thing, that incites hatred, serious contempt, severe ridicule of somebody on the grounds of their race, religion, sexuality, or gender identity. Not enough people know that that is already unlawful. So I would encourage all 58 people here to tell at least one person who may fall into that category that this is against the law.
I was going to just encourage people to make submissions and not feel perfectionist about, the quality, they don't need to be a lawyer. They don't need to be a survivor or a victim. They can be an ally. They can just say, we support, the voices of people who want these changes. But every extra voice showing that critical mass of community support is essential. Thank you so much for holding this.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We can post and share in follow-up email and in the chat the consultation kit that the Queensland Human Rights Commission has put together to support either individuals or organisations that wish to make a submission to the inquiry. It's a really nifty piece of community education, and it's a very easy tool to use to make sure that a submission can go in. Additionally, Multicultural Australia has done a lot of background work to set up safe spaces for people in communities to come and tell their story. One really interesting feature about this particular inquiry is that submissions don't have to be in writing. People can actually record their story, either audio or video, and have that recording submitted to the committee, and they can request that that be confidentially received. So you can do so anonymously as well. I'd just really like to close out the session by thanking Matilda, Naraja, Abiba and Rita for being so generous in your time and so brave in your sharing of stories and your knowledge and expertise. It's been a really terrific panel discussion, and look at us, 2 minutes before midday at 1 o'clock, and we've managed 4 speakers on a panel virtually. That's pretty cool. I also just really want to thank the audience for your participation and for staying on the line. And I think it's been a wonderful discussion that will be able to be made more widely available once we share the transcript. So on that note, thank you to everybody. Keep an eye out for further QCOSS events as we put those up on our website.